So, in a few weeks, the Disney company will turn 100 years old, an anniversary that celebrates everything the company has produced over the last century, from Oswald the Lucky Rabbit down to Strange World. Admittedly, many wonderful projects the company has produced were completed after Walt's passing, but in this series, we've been trying to put a little more Walt back into the celebration. I've gone through dozens and dozens of public interviews on radio, TV, and elsewhere to find audio clips where Walt explains key developments in his life as he understood them. In our first episode, we followed Walt as he started working in animation in Kansas City, and then as he moved to Los Angeles, where he completed the Alice comedies, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and began Mickey Mouse. In our second episode, we explored how Walt arranged early cartoons to capitalize on the advantages of sound, with Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Pluto, and others. And today, we'll explore how Walt, in the mid-1930s, reconfigured studio animation so that it could compete with full-length features produced by other studios. So, just as in other episodes, once we establish the most important issues for the Disney studio in the mid-1930s, we'll let Walt tell a good deal of the story himself. We have many clips of Walt narrating his life story, and those clips will start to show up in our episode about halfway through. So, if you're now all settled in, we're going to set that Wayback Machine to 1935, as Walt, still working in the relatively small Hyperion studio, plans to create a feature. Here we go. To understand what Walt was trying to accomplish in the mid-1930s, we first need to explore how live action had developed itself as an art form in the first part of the century, as Walt specifically wanted his animated feature to hold the emotional depth and narrative complexities then found in live-action films produced by Warner Brothers, MGM, and other major studios. He had the sense that if he would simply make a 90-minute feature in the style of the Mickey Mouse shorts or the Three Little Pigs, it would fail to hold the audience's attention, as they wouldn't deeply identify with the film's protagonist. This, in large part, had to do with how live-action productions in recent years had come to use cameras, lenses, and lighting to create shots that asked an audience to empathize with a story's lead character. Walt understood that once an audience empathized with a lead character, they would easily follow that character through a 90-minute or 2-hour adventure. But the visual tools that live action used to create empathy between an audience and a character on screen were not something yet that had been adopted into animation. Walt could also see that it would be difficult to develop these visual tools, as it would require tremendous technical and artistic advances from those who worked at his studio. When Walt gave interviews, he often summarized sophisticated technological and artistic achievements in a way that most anyone could grasp their key points easily, often avoiding the breadth of what actually had been achieved. This was true even as Walt reinvented studio animation to create Snow White. But today, before we hear how Walt discussed those developments, I want to look at some of that complexity as it was absorbed into a radically new approach to animation as the Disney studio moved toward its first feature. This complexity, in part, was related to how the traditions of animation and live action were different during the 19-teens and 1920s. From a technical standpoint, the story of early cinema is a journey in which live-action directors slowly learned how to use camera angles, lenses, and lighting so that an audience deeply identified with a protagonist on screen. The process took years with endless trial and error. In early American cinema, the visual presentation of film was often on the setting, with a drama taking in long shots. That is, in most every shot, the setting, such as a street, took up far more visual space on screen than the lead characters. The focus of the action was perhaps a car chase or people riding horses along a trail. Even when a film was shot indoors, the camera took in the entire set, allowing the audience to see the drama as if they were watching a stage play. For the most part, actors were relatively unknown during this period, as their presence, or at least their facial expressions, weren't the focus of cinema. The camera was simply too far away to take in the glimmer of an actor's eyes or a subtle smirk wrinkled into the corner of an actress's mouth. Take, for example, the actor-director Charlie Chaplin, who Walt idolized. In his 1928 film, The Circus, the camera is most at home, capturing the little tramp in long shots, being chased down the length of a carnival midway, or losing policemen inside of a funhouse mirror maze. In most shots, Chaplin's full body is presented on screen, from the top of his black hat to the bottom of his oversized shoes, or at least down to his knees. Admittedly, Chaplin's visual style in The Circus was somewhat of a throwback to a slightly earlier period of cinema, but Chaplin was also the director from whom Walt took many of his visual and narrative cues as he worked to create Mickey Mouse. That same year, 1928, as The Circus was released, Walt created Steamboat Willie, which followed camera techniques similar to those that Chaplin often employed. In that 7-minute cartoon, there is not one single close-up of Mickey, nor is there one of Minnie. In every shot, the two mice appear on screen as full-body characters, from the tips of their ears down to the bottom of their feet. Mickey's full body is pictured from the opening, as he spins the pilot's wheel on a steamship, to the closing image where he peels potatoes in the ship's galley. The only shot in the entire cartoon that might be construed as a close-up is one where Pete spits tobacco. But the close-up is not to show Pete's facial expressions and therefore to create empathy, but rather to focus in on a gag with his moving front teeth. His front teeth part like twin curtains so that tobacco juice can fly out onto the ground. Roughly a year later, in 1929, in The Jazz Fool, where Mickey plays the piano, he is again seen in every single shot from ears to toe, without a single close-up. The artistic highlight of this picture is arranged into Mickey's hands. His fingers on the piano keys perfectly correspond to the notes and chords of the recorded music. This is no minor feat of execution and planning, one that Disney worked to achieve in multiple cartoons. The film itself is another bouncy, exuberant musical presentation in which Mickey even sings a few bars. I cannot tell you if the voice here is that of Walt Disney or if someone else's voice is placed into the mouse. The popular story is that Walt was the first voice of Mickey Mouse, and technically this is true. But there's an implication in that line that Walt was the regular voice of Mickey through his early years. Walt is the voice of Mickey in Steamboat Willie, but after that, at least for a little while, Walt allows others at the studio to try out the role. According to Disney composer Carl Stalling, in those early cartoons, all the animators were taking a shot at it, those who wanted to. It was just a falsetto voice. And this underscores the central identity of the Mickey Mouse cartoons in those early years. They weren't so much about the personality of Mickey. If personality was important, the voice would need to remain the same. Rather, they were about the spectacle of dance and movement. A year later, as Mickey moves into cartoons with more dialogue, such as in The Gorilla Mystery, he is still featured ears to toe in every single shot, even when a closer shot would seem more natural, such as when he's talking on the phone to Minnie. A close-up there would be better focused on the presentation of dialogue, but again, this is not how Disney animation was assembled, at least not yet. Once more, a year later, in 1931, in The Beach Party, in every single shot, Mickey is again featured from ears to toe, without a single close-up. In this cartoon, Mickey and his friends dance their way through a sandy picnic before battling a maniacal octopus intent on disrupting their fun. This cartoon is another series of long shots, many of which would now be classified as very long shots, in which the image includes wide backgrounds around Mickey. In contrast, in 1931, the live-action feature, which won Best Picture, Cimarron, the story of the Oklahoma land rush, is filled with close-ups and medium close-ups, often coupled with lighting effects to visually isolate individual actors, techniques that together asked the audience to understand the emotional complexities of specific characters. In the early 1930s, live-action cinematographers started to use newly developed long lenses, which created a shallow depth of focus. These long lenses, with their apertures open, allowed directors to compose unique close-ups in which an actor's face was in tack-sharp focus, while the background softened to a dreamy haze. In terms of visual presentation, such a shot forced an audience to look deeply into the face of an actor, ideally creating an emotional connection between the audience and the character on screen. But while live action was inventing ways to deepen the cinematic experience with empathy, in part by utilizing these new lenses and lighting techniques, Disney animation was still composed almost entirely of long shots. In terms of animation, the benefit of these endless long shots was that the camera was able to pick up choreographed dance numbers moving across a wide stage, like a musical number in a Broadway play. The audience could see all the movement at once, from the animation equivalent of stage left to stage right. In early sound cartoons, most everything moved in time with the music, such as in Steamboat Willie. Not only do Mickey and Minnie move in time with the beat, but various animals and even the boat itself. In the early days of sound, this is what audiences responded to. Animation presented the wonders of musical movement in a way that eluded live action. The technical realities of recording sound while also filming a moving image made it impossible for live-action productions to bristle and sway with the musical exuberance easily arranged into animation. Sound recording equipment was simply too cumbersome, including a very large microphone that needed to be hidden on stage. During the early 1930s, in live action, musical numbers were often filmed in one long take. Sometimes directors would use two cameras so that the final sequence could switch between camera A and camera B while using the same audio soundtrack. Even here, though, these musical numbers were typically captured in just one take, which meant that for years, musical numbers in animated shorts were far more lively and visually engaging than those in live-action productions. But there was a trade-off. During these same years, live-action productions developed another set of cinematic tools to deepen film in other ways. If early silent cinema was more focused on the action and visuals of comedy with a camera taking in the entire set, Hollywood productions of the 1920s and 1930s experimented with camera and lighting techniques to encourage an audience to identify with or understand key characters on screen. Among these tools was the close-up, which focused the camera's gaze on one actor, often asking an audience to understand their emotional state through their facial composition. Newly developed lenses, longer than those of previous years, allowed directors to create shallow field of focus in which an actor's face was perfectly presented on screen, while everything else in the frame melted with a little softness. Another tool was lighting, such as backlighting, which further allowed actors to stand out against a background, often with a slight luminous sheen around the outline of their hair. These tools focused the audience's attention on one character in a way that created intimacy. So while animation played to its strengths, which was musical exuberance and visual humor, live action was deepening another area of cinematic strength, which was creating shots that encouraged the audience to feel empathy with the character dramatized on screen. Close-up shots weren't new in post-sound live-action cinema. Close-up shots had been employed by directors for years, perhaps most notably in The Passion of Joan of Arc, released in 1928, which uses close-ups to dramatize key segments of the story. But in the early sound period, the techniques for the close-up were refined and expanded to add emotional nuance to a film. In terms of camera setups, early live-action productions were mostly arranged around long shots, which allowed the audience to feel as though they were watching a drama or comedy play out on a theatrical stage. The audience saw not only the actors, but the set in each of the shot. By the mid-1920s, American live-action directors were regularly using a variety of shots, including the close-up. The close-up was an experience that didn't exist for an audience watching an actual stage play. It was a way that cinema began to distinguish itself from productions produced on a live stage. It also redefined how cinema worked, allowing an audience to experience an intimate connection with those on screen. And this, in turn, changed Hollywood. In the 19-teens, most actors and actresses were unknown to the public, in large part because the camera didn't yet focus on their faces. But by the early 1930s, actors and actresses, far more so than producers, directors, and writers, were the centerpiece draw of Hollywood entertainment because live-action cameras were now focused on them, often with close-ups. During this same period for animation, shot setups remained tied closely to production strategies of early cinema. Most every shot in Disney animation from the late 1920s to the early 1930s presented a similar view, as though the camera were filming a theatrical stage with lots of background space around each character, though that stage, of course, was drawn and painted, and the characters were a set of drawings as well. This right here was one central problem for Walt when he explored how his animation studio might create a feature. Even as the Disney studio began to develop Snow White, the cartoons were still mostly a collection of long shots. In the 1935 cartoon The Band Concert, Mickey's first journey into Technicolor, he has two medium shots where he's framed from the tip of his ears to his waist as he conducts the band. But the rest are long shots presenting him from ears to toes. A few months later, when Mickey's Next Color Adventure, Mickey's Garden, was released, all of the shots again were arranged as long shots, Mickey presented from ears to toe with a lot of background space behind him. This was simply the familiar staging and camera style for the Disney studio, a strategy that favored comic presentation over character empathy. But by 1935, the audience for American cinema had already learned that features were in part about emotional intimacy with figures presented on screen. To create a feature in which the audience related deeply to animated characters, Walt needed to change the process of creating animation so that it mimicked many of the production tools live action had refined in recent years. A feature that only used long shots, where Snow White and other characters were seen head to toe, likely wouldn't engage an audience in the type of visual empathy that other studios had successfully arranged into live action. In short, the Disney studio needed to create animated drawings of humans that could be used in close-up or medium close-ups so that an audience connected to the hand-drawn characters as deeply as they did with actors in live-action features. These characters also needed to express nuanced emotion layered with complexity, which was also beyond the artistic abilities of many Disney animators. Snow White, when leaving the castle, needed to express fear, a sense of being lost, mixed with muted notes of optimism that her journey would lead to safety. Emotion in Disney shorts up until this time often gestured toward comic overstatement, such as Donald Duck jumping around with anger or Goofy moving through the world with an exaggerated expression of confusion. The characters in Snow White would need to be presented at times in medium close-ups and full close-ups, particularly Snow White, the Queen or the Hag, and the Huntsman. The presentation for these characters, when their faces mostly filled the screen, would require far more nuanced line work than what Disney animators, even lead animators, were accustomed to producing in the shorts when Mickey and Company were presented at a distance. There were many reasons why Walt created art classes at the studio. His animators would need to draw realistic clothes and trees as well as the human form. But this was one of the goals, to elevate the abilities of Walt's animators so that the characters they drew might have greater emotional nuance, especially when the camera moved in tightly on them.
The first thing I did when I got a little money to experiment, I put all my artists back in school. The art schools that existed then didn't quite have enough for what we needed, so we set up our own art school.
Well, you were inventing a new art anyway.
Well, yes, but we were just going a little bit beyond what they were getting in the art school, where they work with the static figure. Now, we were dealing in motion, movement, and the flow of movement, the flow of things, you know, action, reaction, all of that. So we had to set up our own school. And out of that school had come the artists that now make up my staff here, and more than that, the artists that make up most all of the cartoon outfits in Hollywood, were directly or indirectly out of my school. Yes, there's many technical advances, but basically the thing that gives us more depth is the ability to draw the way it should be drawn for this medium. You get a lot of depth out of the way you shape a line, the way you draw the figures. That contributes an awful lot to the depth and to the overall effect that you see today with the cartoon.
As you can hear in these two clips, Walt was focused on the larger picture without moving into the nuances of his achievements. One reason for this was that in the middle of the 20th century, when these interviews were recorded, the recent traditions of cinema were likely clear to most listeners, as they had lived through this era. In short, Walt understood that there were two cinematic traditions in America. Animation had trained its audience to view animation as the place of musical spectacle and visual comedy, and live action had trained its audience to view live-action features as the space where an audience deeply identified with the characters on screen, regardless of the genre format of the film, such as a comedy, adventure story, a romance, or a tragedy. Live action had also developed a series of visual techniques to further the goals of visual empathy. And by the mid-1930s, the audience understood how to use these visual cues to connect themselves with characters on the screen. These were the tools, such as the close-up and more nuanced acting, that Walt now wanted to replicate so that an audience in the late 1930s could read animation in the same way they read live action. But there was another goal here for the art classes. Walt needed his animators to create scenes in which those drawings represented subtle shades of emotions. Resentment slowly building toward anger, fear simmering toward loss, and surprise expanding into happiness. In previous years, animators had never had to work through such distinctions with Mickey and his friends, but now they needed to create drawings in which the action mimicked live-action acting.
We have to create personalities out of line drawings. For example, if we were making Snow White with living actors, we could turn the story over to them, and each actor would introduce bits of business which would build up the character he was playing.
That's right.
But with our little characters, we have to plan out every movement that they make, even to the wink of the eye. In other words, we have to literally pull everything out of the air, and then with a pencil and paper, we start building a picture.
But stronger drawings and more exact emotional expression and movement weren't the only ways that Walt wanted an animated film to mimic live action. Another production area that Walt wanted to improve was how depth was presented on screen with drawings. Live action had natural depth because the camera filmed the physical world, but animated films had limited depth. Typically, there were two layers to create depth: Animated cells which held the hand-drawn characters were positioned on top of a painted background. Walt understood that depth in animation was different than natural depth in live action. If a live action camera followed a person walking down the road at night, the person, framed by a moving camera, moved down the road. As the camera moved, a tree in the background might move across the shot, but appeared to move at a far slower speed than the person in the foreground. Beyond that, the moon in the far background doesn't move at all. The camera may follow that person for a mile or 5 miles, but the moon will appear to be in the same place no matter how far the person walks and no matter how many trees move across the shot. But over in animation, if the tree moved across the background, the moon needed to move at the same speed, as both the tree and the moon were painted on the same piece of paper. This was a problem that Walt wanted to solve with technology. In the early 1930s, animation had only those 2 layers, that foreground cell with the characters and the one background painting. If the background painting was moved as the person walked down the road, the tree and the moon, as we've discussed, would move at the same rate of speed as they were on the same piece of paper. Walt needed a device that separated foreground action from midground action, from far background action, so that each visual element could move at a different rate of speed, creating a more natural presentation. The goal here was for a background painting to behave more like scenery in the real world. The effect of a layered background was almost always how Walt explained his aims for the multiplane camera. But there was another element of depth wrapped up with the multiplane. Live-action studios, with the use of those long lenses and wide aperture settings, were able to visually isolate foreground images from elements in the background, which were often presented with a subtle blur. With a standard downward-facing table camera, animation production had no way to mimic the beauty of these live-action shots. But the multiplane camera was able to help with this as well. A character in the foreground might be in focus, while, say, a forest in the background could be slightly out of focus, thereby drawing the audience's attention more fully to the character, exactly as it was done in live-action productions. The multiplane camera was a crane setup in which the camera, in some cases 20 feet above the production floor, was pointed down so that its lens looked through different layers of drawings and paintings, which were arranged individually on glass planes or shelves. On the top plane in the foreground, positioned maybe a foot or so from the camera, was typically the characters. On the 2 or 3 middle shelves, positioned a few feet from the camera, were midground elements. On the bottom shelf was the background painting, maybe a half-dozen feet or so from the lens. This setup not only allowed for different layers to move at different rates of speed, but also allowed Disney to better separate foreground elements from background areas, as the foreground elements could be better lit and in sharper focus than background elements which might appear dimmer or slightly hazy. In this way, Walt was redefining animation so that, again, an audience would respond to animated cues on screen in the exact same way they were used to responding to cues in an artfully made live-action feature. The goal here was to adapt visual strategies of live action so that an audience would see animation as having the same complexities as a big-budget live-action film, such as Grand Hotel or Mutiny on the Bounty.
Well, we had to develop a camera. We developed a special camera here called the multiplane camera. That's because it uses many planes. And we have, I think, up as high as 7 levels. It gives a sort of a third dimension in the drawing.
The last issue I want to look at is color. Many fans know that Disney was an early adopter of the 3-strip Technicolor process, sometimes known as the Technicolor's process number 4. This was the first reliable method to present a full range of colors across the screen. There were earlier methods of creating color in film. Early American animator Winsor McCay, for example, used to hand ink individual frames of processed film to create spot color in some of his animation. Also, there were earlier color processes, which typically focused on two-strip color. These mostly presented the blue and red spectrums while leaving out other colors such as bright greens and purples, creating a partial color print. The three-strip Technicolor process was the first to capture the breadth of color as they were found in the natural world. And many fans also know that Disney first began to use the three-strip Technicolor process with the 1932 cartoon Flowers and Trees, which proved a tremendous success. And looking back at this, over nearly 90 years of history, it would seem that the 1932 color short would lead somewhat directly to the use of full color in the 1937 feature Snow White, but there's an invisible story here as well. The cost to produce a color film was substantially more than the cost to produce one in black and white. Not only was there the additional expense to license Technicolor's process and to use a large and unwieldy color camera, there was also the cost of color prints. Theatrical color prints, which could only be produced by a Technicolor lab, cost substantially more to create than black and white prints. In 1932, Roy Disney estimated that color would raise the production cost of each cartoon by 60%. Initially, he objected to color and its costs, telling Walt that the plan would allow Technicolor to grow rich and forced Disney into bankruptcy. But he eventually gave in. Disney entered into a multi-year exclusive contract with Technicolor, which meant that no other animation studio could use the three-strip process, though the three-strip color process remained available for live-action studios. Even with this, Disney initially only produced the Silly Symphonies in color to increase their popularity and kept the Mickeys, which were already very popular, in black and white for another 3 years. The cost of color, though significant, was far more manageable for a 6-minute cartoon than it was for a 90-minute feature. Most Hollywood studios did not see any value in producing color features, as they didn't believe that ticket sales would offset the tremendous expense in creating films in color. In 1932, after Flowers and Trees was released and was successful, no Hollywood studio produced a color feature. In 1933, also no color features. In 1934, the same thing. In fact, when Disney started in on Snow White in earnest in 1935, no major studios had produced a color feature, though by this time one was finally in production, a film called Becky Sharp, which would be released that summer. But as Walt ventured toward a color feature, the studio did not know how an audience would react to 90 minutes of color. There was a belief that a color film of that length might produce eye strain and be uncomfortable to watch, particularly if the feature were filled with the bright colors that occupied the Silly Symphony shorts. Then there was this issue. The color values used so far in Disney animation allowed the Silly Symphonies to have tones similar to that of newspaper comics. The colors were bright, expressive, and tended toward primary values. Though Technicolor was built as presenting colors as seen in the natural world, the Disney use of Technicolor was anything but natural. Technicolor allowed animation directors to select colors in a way to better compose the overall presentation of a scene. Essentially, colors were used for emotional engagement. This would later be true for many live-action features as well. Color in The Wizard of Oz, for example, wasn't arranged to mimic the color values of real life, but rather to create a tonal composition that would be engaging for the viewer. Artists at the Disney studio believed that 90 minutes of color, particularly if it was the type of color then arranged for the Silly Symphonies, would be too bright and aggressive for an audience to endure for 90 minutes. Also, the color values of the Silly Symphonies suggested a world filled with light-hearted exuberance and musical play. The color values of Snow White, a story with far richer and more disturbing emotional tones, needed to be more nuanced and darker. The darker tones many at the studio believed would also be easier on the eyes. In this way, Disney explored ways to remake how color was used in animation. Disney artists believed that the overall presentation needed to radically shift from the type of color they had been using in the shorts for years. Disney exchanged the bright color of the Silly Symphonies and the Mickeys to a palette of darker and more nuanced colors to create their first feature. In this, color was a tool that the studio refined over its early features. The studio's fourth feature, a few years later, Dumbo, like modern animated features, has a lot of color contrast from sequence to sequence, from the nighttime shots to the big top to the pink elephants to the scene at dawn where Dumbo learns to fly. By this feature, the progression of color told its own story, from the bright-colored optimism of Dumbo's arrival to the red-toned trouble of the circus acts, to the darkness of the dream sequence, and then a return to the bright colors as Dumbo learns to fly. By this point in the studio's development, Disney artists had learned to suggest narrative moods with changing colors. You can chart the emotional progression of Dumbo's story simply by looking at how the main colors change from sequence to sequence. But these narrative concerns of color didn't frame the use of color in Snow White. Snow White largely has two color modes with some mild variations. The first mode is at the castle as the film opens with its greens, blues, and shades of stone. This color scheme is quickly replaced by far darker and more earthy tones once Snow White flees the huntsman and runs into the woods. Almost surely these darker and more earthy tones were used to ensure that the audience could comfortably watch a 90-minute film with projected color. In this way, color didn't make Snow White look like a live-action feature. It made it look more like a moving painting, in which presentation was used in part for visual unity and in part for viewer engagement and comfort. And unlike later Disney films, Snow White remained inside of this earthy color palette more or less until the end of its story. Again, here's Walt, who in interviews tended to focus on the large picture, not the complexities of what the studio had actually accomplished.
I believe we've made great strides in animation and color. We've developed a special process for color that gives us dimension, depth.
Been preparing for that for some time, haven't you?
Yes, we've been at it for the past 2 years. We won't be finished completely with Snow White until sometime early next year. You see, it's going to run 10 reels, which means a showing time of 1 hour and a half. No cartoon production has ever run that long before. Well, it's a well-known fairy tale. Every country's familiar with it. That's why we feel justified in putting $1 million into it.
With these elements in place, Walt and his studio could move forward to create an animated feature whose visual presentation was far more complex than anything previously created by Disney. And for the most part, Walt was creating a feature that allowed an audience to engage the presentation in the same way they engaged live-action features, as the Disney effort in many ways reworked animation so that it would follow the traditions of live-action features, not the tradition of short cartoons. These new processes elevated the cost of the feature far more than anyone at the studio could have expected.
I didn't know what I had or what would happen or anything. We had the family fortune. We had everything wrapped up in Snow White. In fact, the banker, I think, was losing more sleep than I was.
But in interviews, Walt tended not to focus so much on costs, rather on the achievements. He knew that Snow White would either establish his studio as a new type of animation company, or if the film failed, it would utterly bankrupt him. He was nervous as he moved forward towards the film's premiere, as that would be the moment where he knew what the future held for him. And the premiere of Snow White is where we will pick up this story next time we touch down into the series, as Snow White blazes across the screen at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles, about 8 miles from the expanding Disney studio in Silver Lake, where the film had been produced. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Also, before I go, I wanted to suggest an activity. We've probably all seen Snow White at some time, but perhaps if you were to see it now, you might notice a few new things that would make it interesting for you. If you wanted to make a night of this activity, first watch an early Mickey short. I think Mickey's Garden would be ideal, but at least presently Mickey's Garden's not on Disney+, but you can find it online. So maybe play the band concert, which is on Disney+. Notice the shot framing, the lack of close-ups, the lack of subtle emotion in the characters, the use of color, and the arrangement of depth. This film was released in 1935, as was Mickey's Garden. Then watch Snow White, which came out in 1937, a little over 2 years later, and enjoy how Walt was able to transform the look of animation. The visual tones of the two films, the Mickey and Snow White, are so different that they look like they might have been produced by two entirely different studios. Also, I wanted to point out that Disney is about to release a new 4K and Blu-ray presentation of Snow White, in which the studio has performed a new scan of the original nitrate negative, and then worked with color values so the scans match those values that were originally arranged for this film. This presentation is different than the one presently on Disney+. From the scans I've seen so far, the presentation looks superior to the version on the most recent Blu-ray and to the version that's on Disney+. So if you wanted to explore exactly what Walt was trying to achieve visually with this film, this disc set is probably your best way to do that, unless you own a time machine that can take you back to 1937 and the premiere at Carthy Circle. This disc set is presently up as a pre-order on Amazon for about $22. It will be released in mid-October. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available anywhere else. But the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support what we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly Bandcamp subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.